Alright, welcome to another guide in the series on combat mechanics, skills and Tower of Knowledge passives. We are going to talk about auras and aura synergies for this one, making it the second to last video. All we need is passives to be out, and then you'll have the complete collection of all of the different types of classes for skills and Tower of Knowledge, skills and passives. So for this one, we're going to talk about auras. These skills are Tower of Knowledge passives that provide combat buffs and combat debuffs passively to all immortals on the field. Auras are in general powerful skills. Every single one of them is quite powerful in given situations, in certain situations. As such, they're also limited in use. That means that you can only equip one aura per immortal, simply because loading up a hard support like Richard or Zeno with 3 auras would make that entirely too powerful. So as a class of skills, auras, there's not that much to them. All you need to remember and know is that you can equip 1 per immortal, and that auras provide a unique effect throughout the entire battle. We did Graces and Blessings earlier today, and what we learned there was powerful buffs that are temporal, meaning they will be active for the first 12 or 18 seconds. As for auras, buffs interact with your immortals in the same way, but auras are permanent states. They cannot be dispelled and they do not run out. As for the synergies, when creating synergies with auras, it's quite important that you have a clear read on the purpose of your setup as well as that of your enemy. Auras are highly context dependent, so both your setup, what's the purpose, what do you want to do, what scales well with what you're running, but also what are you fighting. For instance, when I'm fighting against a holy team holy that relies on a high amount of damage instances, think of both Gilgamesh and Manco. They hit with an extremely high amount of damage instances. Manco drops a lot of big bombs on your troops. They deal AoE damage, all of them, and they tick very, very often. So it's many low damage skills. That means that something like Shelter is an aura that becomes insanely valuable for you to have on, because every single time you receive a damage instance, there's a chance that Shelter will proc. Think back to the one we did on trigger skills, right? You have a chance to proc the Shelter recovery, the healing, the troop HP healing. That makes it extremely powerful for fighting holy, but also quite weak against the contrary kind of setup. Think of something that has huge burst damage in single instances, something like an Emperor's Wu. You're not going to get a lot of Shelter procs fighting Wu, but you will get insane mounts fighting Gilgamesh. Some buff-like auras like Shelter and Berserk have a tricky condition. Now, we mentioned it shortly ago, but and we also talked about it in the guide on trigger skills. But what basically happens with both these things are that Shelter and Berserk, they have a trigger condition, being for Shelter incoming damage, Berserk landing an attack. As such, you think about, when we talked about Shelter, we were saying, okay, so when we take a lot of damage instances, Shelter gains more value. Likewise, when we deal a lot of damage instances, Berserk gains a lot of damage. But those damage instances also have to be normal attacks. So we need a high attack speed and an attack speed centric march setup in order to get high value out of Berserk. Lastly, there's a debuff. I just want to mention these auras comes in 2 different forms, right? You got the friendly ones, the ones buffing your troops, and then you got the offensive ones, the ones debuffing your enemy's troops. There are quite a lot of those. We have Coercion, Paralysis, Misleading, Malice, and Weakness. Now, these should be used based on your enemy's combat skills and setup. They work also just like grace effects, but without the expiration timer, and they're not dispellable. Think about what your setup is weak against and use an aura to bolster your defenses against those setups. So like we said about Berserk and Shelter, these are trigger based auras. They work well against certain things. Berserk, Coercion, Paralysis, Misleading, and Malice are debuff auras, and Weakness and Sacrifice are buff auras. So that's the 3 different kinds of aura types. That'll end sort of the thing on what is auras in general. So let's talk more about what they are powerful against and when you should use what kind of aura. Auras are powerful because they're limited, but also limited. And as such, you must try and play to the advantages of your own setup as well as that of your main rivals. Figure out who do you fight the most, who you do have problems fighting against, what kind of a meta is going on. Are you a top level mid spender perhaps? Then you're fighting a lot of holy marches. Are you maybe a free to play? Do you fight in a newer server where Earth reigns supreme? Then that's kind of the thing you want to counter. Do you want to counter water? Do you want to counter fire? What kind of setups are you facing? That's really what's going to decide what kind of auras are best for you. I'm not going to do a tier list. I know many players are asking me to do a tier list for Tower Knowledge skills specifically for auras, but I'm not going to do that because it depends so much on what you run as well as what your enemy is running. So let's say, for instance, you're doing sort of, let's make an arch build, the fire team as this big bursty front-loaded team. What you want to do in that, how do you want to think about auras in that way, is that you want to run stuff like Sacrifice and Weakness, to boost the magic burst potential of your march. In order to counter that, like let's say we're facing an enemy running a setup like this, then you want to run something like Malice to defend against those big bursty crits. Now, running stuff like this, you want to avoid doing things like Coercion and Berserk, because as a fire guy, you're relying on magic damage, but you must run them counter to this. You have to run these 2 skills, Coercion and Berserk, if you're doing something like the Alex Barker Wind Hybrid setup. This is again just emphasizing my point of not doing a tier list, and don't listen too much to tier lists. Think about what your march is actually doing. Here we have a very good example. You got Berserk and Coercion as being the absolute best skills for a Wind Hybrid, and the absolute worst skills for a dual mage fire. But if you're faced with hard, holy, or earth enemies, then Shelter can be very helpful, like I said, and likewise against Merlin Waters, its effects are quite a lot less. Again, the same point. Kind of see what I'm trying to get at here? So for the following, the remainder of this guide, we're going to dive a bit deeper into every single aura of Infinity Kingdom. We're going to make some, I'm going to make some suggestions on when they are useful and when they are not. I'm going to use the same kind of train of thought that I just tried to explain. But ultimately you need to determine for yourself what's the purpose of your build and try to figure out what auras is then right for you. Likewise, what are you facing and what can you do to counter that? First of all, we have Berserk. Berserk is useful for attack speed setups like Hannibal Barker and Alexander builds. That's because the attack speed buff provided gets great value from on these 2 models. They scale exceptionally well with attack speed. Moreover, because they are in per default and natively high attack speed immortals, the attack speed boost is larger than elsewhere, and the chance to trigger its healing effects is also greater. That works well in combination with things like Blessing of Speed. Let's say you're running an Earth-Wind Hybrid, you've got both of these guys in there, then you want to run Blessing of Speed as well. And in many instances, you want to run Blessing of Speed with Berserk if you're doing a march with also just a single one of these 2 models. Moving on to the second aura, we have Shelter. Shelter is a defensive aura that triggers off of enemy incoming damage. We talked about that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Just going to say that you want to run Shelter against high amount of damage instances, fighting things like the Wind Earth Hybrid or like Holy. You're going to get a lot of incoming damage ticks. Alexandra and Hannibal Barca is going to hit you I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 times more than you hit them, meaning that Shelter is high value just because they have so much attack speed. Likewise, Manko and Gilga, high frequency casters, which hit in AoE, meaning many damage instances, and high value in Shelter. This does not work well against teams like Fire, other magic dependent teams, which has large amounts of single attack damage and large amounts of front loaded damage. Moving on to the third aura, Paralysis, and we're gonna keep sort of so far all auras have been pretty relevant to Hannibal Barca and Alexander, but we're gonna continue down that road because Paralysis is also an attack speed aura, but it's a debuff on your enemy that makes it a counter skill. It's something that you will only find value in when you're trying to counter something specific, when you're faced with an enemy that relies on high attack speed. Prime example being fighting the Earth Wind hybrid team that relies on this high attack speed on Hannibal Barca and Alexander. Paralysis has a very high value as it reduces their attack speed by 15%, quite significantly. However, it is next to useless, Paralysis that is, against setups that rely on time-based triggers and spellcasting. The fourth aura we have is Misleading. Misleading reduces the accuracy of your enemy immortals. That means that it works very well against physical damage setups, since accuracy is a purely physical immortal attribute. Physical attacks can be dodged, and dodging provides a 100% damage mitigation, making it an extremely powerful defense mechanic against purely physical setups. However, Misleading can also be countered by another aura called Coercion, and should only be used sort of in synergy with other skills that provide enhanced dodge chance, especially at higher levels where you have the Dragon Talons unlocked. Then your enemy is going to have a greater accuracy than at baseline, and Misleading is not going to provide a huge value. And if you're fighting against someone max Dragon Talons and Coercion, Misleading doesn't really do much of an impact without some synergies. What that means is that, for instance, in a wind setup, it can work together with the Turmoil Breath that also reduces enemy accuracy. You're gonna get a whopping 45% reduction of enemy accuracy. Top that with an After Image Blessing, and you will have a quite insane chance to dodge enemy attacks, making it an excellent way to hard counter fully physical damage dependent setups. However, this passive Misleading has absolutely no value when fighting against magic damage, since magic attacks cannot be dodged at all. Fifth, we've got Malice. Malice reduces the critical chance of your enemy's immortals. This makes it a powerful and useful passive against pretty much all setups. You will always get value from not taking as many critical hits. Crits are a big deal in Infinity Kingdom, and not reducing the chance to take a critical hit will do well in almost any setup. However, there are more value to be had from Malice in specific situations. Like if you're fighting someone who's stacking all the crit trigger skills. If you're fighting let's say a Fire March that uses Chase on its Woo and Energy Burst on Hippo, well then Malice has a much greater than normal value because it hard counters those two skills. Likewise, it works very well against fire setups in general, as well as Merlin-centric magic. That's because magic damage is quite crit dependent, and the resilience and stuff like Malice reducing crit chance is really one of the only ways to defend against big magic damage. As a side note, I want to say that in general, it's always a good passive, especially on sustained setups, Malice that is. And that's because reducing the chance to take a critical hit means that you are smoothing the rate and the flow of incoming damage and damage taken. You know, you get additional value from your shields and your healing, even if you're incurring sort of the same amount of total damage taken, but by having it smoothed out and not taking critical hits, but just taking hits, that means that you have a greater effect on absorb rates of Charles shields. You know, the uptime is going to be greater because it doesn't just leave right away. You get a chance to keep it going all the time. Likewise, it leaves time for healers to top off troops continuously. And do remember that burst damage is so powerful because it kills troops, whereas smooth damage leaves them wounded and healable. So if you can reduce the amount of critical hits taken by your troops, let's say we're running something like Xeno or Theo, then we want to reduce the amount of critical hits taken and take normal damage instead, because taking less of a hit to our troop count means that Theo's healing can be more efficient. Aura number 6 is weakness. Weakness reduces the resiliency of the resilient rate of all enemy models by 20%. That means that this is an aura that buffs the chances of your immortals to land a critical strike. It's a pretty simple one. You know, your chances for any attack to roll a critical hit is going to be greater the less resilience your enemy have and the more critical hit rating you have. Since critical hits is always good value, you will always get solid output by using something like weakness. That being said, there are superior value to be had. Let's say, most players are running multiple marches, right? So you need to decide, where am I using weakness? You're gonna get value out of it anywhere, and it's gonna be a very good passive anywhere. But across multiple setups, you want to figure out what kind of setup actually gains superior value from the added critical hits. Personally, I use it on my fire team because fire is highly crit dependent. It's a bursty team that also scales with crit, especially when you're running something like Xeon or Chase. It pairs particularly well, obviously, with Chase and Energy Burst, since we're boosting the trigger rate of these skills. The 7th aura that we have is an aura called Sacrifice. Sacrifice has a chance to increase your immortal's energy by X amount, by 100. However, this is not significant to this passive. I mean, it's decent, but it's only a 15% chance, so it's not a big deal. What you're really looking for this passive is the buff that provides up to 15% increased damage to 2 of your friendly immortals. What you want to make sure of when running something like Sacrifice is that you equip it on a support type immortal, something like Cyrus, Dido, Charles. They all benefit from, let's say, the energy proc actually procs. That's great. But also you are boosting 2 of your friendly immortals and running it on a support. The chances are you're gonna hit one of your damage dealers. It also means that you gain superior value from Sacrifice if you are running a single support and 3 damage dealers, because you will always get a 50% damage boost to 2 of your DPSs. The 8th aura is Coercion. Coercion is a very powerful debuff aura that reduces the dodge rate of all of your enemy models. As such, you get very high value from this aura in physical heavy setups. That means that if you're running something like Bethany, Alexander, you're running Barca, Atalanta, Manco, and Gilgamesh, these immortals as your primary damage dealers, then Coercion is an absolute must-have passive. Making sure that you stay as close to hit capped as possible is very important. You should, however, also test out how does your march perform without this passive to make sure that you actually need the increased accuracy or, well, the reduction to enemy dodge rate. If you are already hit capped fighting, then this has no value whatsoever. But if you do get some dodges on some of your immortals attacks, then you want to run coercion, no questions asked. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, if you're running something like a dual mage setup, then coercion is pretty much useless, since magic attacks cannot miss to begin with, and therefore you require no accuracy stat, and the enemy's dodge rate is completely irrelevant. Number 9 on the list, and the last one, is Fear of Domination. Fear of Domination is the newest aura in the bunch. It's one of the, I'm still calling them new Tower of Knowledge skills, despite the fact that they've been out for half a year now. But so few players actually have these skills that they are still new in my mind. You require the Triss event to unlock this skill, and as such, not a lot of players have them available. But when you do, and if you do, then it works quite well for most setups. You will, however, just like some of the other auras, find superior value from it in big nuke burst setups. Fire or Shadow is the prime examples. Here you have dragons that would make a huge impact, well, lightning as well. Here you have, with these three, you have dragons that make a huge impact on the enemy troop count, dealing massive damage and true damage right off the bat, making this very powerful, since you're gonna quickly reduce the enemy's HP below 50%. That's it for aura skills. As I said, I know that a lot of you are gonna ask me for a tier list. You've already asked, and you're probably gonna keep doing it when I release this one. I'm not gonna do it simply because they are, auras are entirely dependent on your setup and your enemy setup. Like I said in this video, the best auras are useless in some fights, and bad auras are insanely valuable when used to hard counter certain builds. As always, please do subscribe to the channel. I consistently release new content here on the IK channel and on the official IK Wiki website. Links are in the description. On these channels you can find guides from everything in IK, from events to talents, passives, finished builds, and game mechanics. With that, I'm gonna leave you, and as always, thank you for watching, and see you for the next one.